The clatter of wooden wheels on uneven dirt roads matched the hammering of Tommy's heart. He ran through the crowded streets of Silverridge, clutching a loaf of bread to his chest as angry shouts followed him through the bustling Wyoming town. At 12 years old, Tommy was all bone and sinew, his face smudged with the dust that seemed to coat everything in this frontier settlement in 1876. His stomach had been empty for 2 days, and desperation had finally pushed him to snatch the fresh baked loaf from Widow Harrington's bakery windowsill. "Stop that thief!" The widow's voice carried through the main street, drawing unwanted attention to the fleeing boy. Tommy ducked between wagons and darted around horses, his bare feet kicking up dust as he ran. The bread was still warm against his chest, and the smell of it made his empty stomach clench painfully. He just needed to make it to the alley behind the saloon, where he could hide and finally satisfy his gnawing hunger. He was so focused on his escape that he didn't see the tall figure step out from the general store until he collided with the man's long legs. Tommy bounced backward, landing hard on the dirt road, the precious bread tumbling from his grasp. "Whoa there, partner," a deep voice said as a shadow fell over him. Tommy scrambled backward, expecting a blow or rough hands dragging him toward the sheriff's office. Instead, he found himself looking up at a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. The stranger wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, dusty riding clothes, and a holstered pistol at his hip. A genuine cowboy, unlike the many drifters who passed through claiming to be such. "I believe you dropped something," the man said, bending to pick up the now dusty loaf. Instead of calling for the sheriff, he offered his other hand to Tommy. "Looks like you were in an awful hurry." Behind them, Tommy could hear the widow's angry voice growing closer. He tensed, ready to bolt again, but something in the cowboy's eyes made him hesitate. "You hungry, son?" the cowboy asked quietly. Tommy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The cowboy's weathered face softened. "My name's Matthew Wade," he said, still holding out his hand. "And I think you'd better come with me. You'll eat with me today." Tommy stared at the offered hand, suspicion warring with desperate hunger, but something in Matthew's steady gaze convinced him, and he cautiously placed his small hand in the cowboy's much larger one. Matthew helped the boy to his feet just as Widow Harrington rounded the corner, her face flushed with exertion and anger. "There he is. That's the little thief who stole my bread," she exclaimed, pointing an accusing finger at Tommy. Matthew stepped slightly in front of the boy. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat politely, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The boy was running an errand for me." The widow's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't explain why he took my bread without paying." Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. "My apologies for the confusion. I sent him with money, but he must have been in such a hurry he forgot to use it." He pressed the coins into her hand far more than the bread was worth. "For your trouble." Widow Harrington looked from the coins to Matthew's face, then to Tommy, who was trying to make himself as small as possible behind the cowboy. Her expression softened slightly. "Well, I suppose mistakes happen, but next time, young man, remember your manners." Tommy nodded silently, hardly believing his luck. After the widow walked away, Matthew looked down at Tommy, still holding the dusty loaf of bread. "Now, how about we get you something proper to eat? This has seen better days." He tossed the loaf to a grateful stray dog who had been watching the exchange with hopeful eyes. Tommy's stomach growled loudly in response, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Matthew led Tommy to the Silver Dollar Saloon, one of the more reputable establishments in town. As they entered, several patrons nodded respectfully to Matthew, and the barkeeper called out a greeting. "Afternoon, Matt. Usual table?" "Thanks, Joe, and 2 meals today, if you please." Tommy looked around wide-eyed as Matthew guided him to a small table in the corner. He'd never been inside the saloon before. It wasn't a place for children, but he'd often pressed his face against the windows, watching the card games and listening to the piano music that spilled out into the street. "You live around here?" Matthew asked as they sat down. Tommy shook his head. "Not really. I sleep where I can. Parents dead," Tommy said flatly. "Pa in the mine collapsed last year, Ma from fever this past winter." Matthew nodded, unsurprised but sympathetic. Death was a common companion on the frontier, and orphans were unfortunately not rare. Been on your own since then? Yes, sir. Tommy fidgeted with the frayed edge of his too small shirt. I was working at the livery, but Mr. Peterson said he couldn't keep me on after I got sick last month. Before Matthew could respond, a young woman approached their table carrying 2 plates heaped with food. Tommy's eyes widened at the sight of steaming beans, potatoes, and what looked like real beef. Here you are, Matt, she said, setting down the plates. Her voice was warm and she had a kind smile that reached her bright eyes. And who's your friend this is? Matthew paused, realizing he hadn't asked the boy's name. Tommy, the boy supplied shyly. Tommy, Matthew repeated. Tommy, this is Daisy King. She owns this place. Daisy smiled warmly at the boy. Well, Tommy, it's a pleasure to meet you. Any friend of Matt's is welcome here. Tommy stared at her in wonder. She was pretty, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical style and a simple but clean dress. Unlike some of the women who worked in saloons, there was nothing flashy about her appearance, but something in her eyes caught and held Tommy's attention, a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of his mother. Thank you, madam, he managed to say. Enjoy your meal, she said, touching Matthew's shoulder lightly before moving away to attend to other customers. Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He fell upon the food with the desperation of the truly hungry, barely remembering to use the fork provided. Matthew ate at a more measured pace, watching the boy with thoughtful eyes. Slow down a bit, he advised gently. It's not going anywhere and you'll make yourself sick eating that fast on an empty stomach. Tommy nodded, making a visible effort to eat more slowly. Between mouthfuls, he glanced curiously at Matthew. Why'd you help me, mister? Matthew considered the question. Let's just say I know what it's like to be hungry and alone. Tommy's eyes widened slightly. It was hard to imagine this confident man ever being in his position. I was about your age when I lost my folks, Matthew continued. Got taken in by a rancher who needed extra hands. He was a hard man but fair, taught me everything I know. Is that your ranch? Tommy asked, gesturing vaguely toward the town's outskirts. Matthew shook his head. No, I work for the Bar W Ranch about 10 miles west of here. I'm the foreman there. What's a foreman do? Keeps things running smooth, makes sure the cattle are healthy, the hands do their work, and the boss stays happy. A small smile tugged at Matthew's lips. It's a good life if you don't mind hard work and long days. Tommy nodded thoughtfully, scraping up the last of the beans with his fork. For the first time in months, his stomach felt pleasantly full. Thank you for the food, Mr. Wade. Matt's fine, the cowboy replied, and you're welcome. As they finished their meal, Daisy returned to their table. Everything to your liking, perfect as always, Daisy, Matthew said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. Tommy didn't miss the way Daisy's cheeks colored slightly at Matthew's words, nor the way the cowboy's eyes lingered on her face. There was history there, he realized with a child's intuitive understanding of adult matters. Tommy here was just telling me about his situation, Matthew said, his expression growing more serious. Seems he's been on his own since winter. Daisy's gaze softened as she looked at the boy. Is that so? Where have you been sleeping, Tommy? Tommy shrugged. Different places. The livery sometimes, when Mr. Peterson lets me. The abandoned cabin by the creek when it's not too cold. Daisy and Matthew exchanged a look that Tommy couldn't quite interpret. We need to figure something out for you, Matthew said firmly. A boy your age shouldn't be fending for himself. Hope flared briefly in Tommy's chest, but he quickly tamped it down. He'd learned the hard way that hope usually led to disappointment. I manage all right, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I'm sure you do, Daisy said gently, but everyone needs help sometimes. The saloon door swung open then, admitting a group of dusty cowboys fresh off the trail. Daisy sighed. Duty calls. You two stay as long as you like. She squeezed Matthew's shoulder again before hurrying to attend to the new customers. Matthew watched her go with a thoughtful expression before turning back to Tommy. How would you feel about coming out to the ranch with me? We could use an extra hand, especially with someone who's worked in a livery before. Tommy stared at him, waiting for the joke or the catch. When neither came, he asked suspiciously, What would I have to do? Start with simple chores, feeding the horses, mucking stalls, that sort of thing. If you show promise, you could learn to work with the cattle eventually. You'd have a roof over your head, regular meals, and fair pay for your work. It sounded too good to be true, which was precisely why Tommy hesitated. In his experience, offers like this usually came with hidden costs. Why would you do that for me? Matthew's expression turned reflective. Like I said, I was in your boots once. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. Seems only right to do the same. He paused, then added more softly, plus, I'd sleep better knowing you weren't out stealing bread and risking a jail cell. Tommy considered this. The prospect of regular meals and a safe place to sleep was incredibly tempting. But leaving town would mean leaving behind the only place he'd ever known, the place where his parents were buried. Could I visit town sometimes? He asked hesitantly. To see my ma and pa. Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. Of course, I come into town every couple of weeks for supplies. You could come along. Tommy nodded slowly. Okay then, I'll come. Matthew smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Good man, we'll leave tomorrow morning. For tonight, we'll get you a room at the boarding house. As Matthew settled their bill, Tommy noticed how his eyes kept finding Daisy across the room. The cowboy's expression softened whenever he looked at her, and more than once, Tommy caught Daisy glancing their way too. You sweet on Miss King. Tommy asked bluntly as they stepped out onto the boardwalk. Matthew looked startled, then chuckled. You don't miss much, do you? He adjusted his hat, looking thoughtful. Daisy and I, we have history, known each other since we were not much older than you. Why aren't you married then? Tommy asked with a child's directness. A shadow passed over Matthew's face. Life gets complicated, Tommy. Sometimes the timing isn't right. He cleared his throat. Come on, let's get you settled at Mrs. Hoffman's boarding house. You look like you could use a bath and a proper night's sleep. Tommy followed, but filed away Matthew's reaction for later consideration. There was clearly more to the story between the cowboy and the saloon owner. Mrs. Hoffman, a plump German woman who ran the town's cleanest boarding house, took one look at Tommy's dirty face and torn clothes and immediately declared that a bath was non-negotiable. An hour later, scrubbed pink and wearing a nightshirt that had belonged to Mrs. Hoffman's son, now grown and living in Denver, Tommy lay in a real bed for the first time in months. I'll come for you at first light, Matthew said from the doorway. Try to get some rest. Tommy nodded sleepily, already drifting off in the unaccustomed comfort of the clean sheets and soft mattress. Matthew watched the boy for a moment, then quietly closed the door. Instead of heading to his own room, however, he found himself walking back toward the Silver Dollar. The evening was warm, and most of the town was still awake, with light and music spilling from the various establishments along the main street. The saloon was busy when he entered, but Daisy spotted him immediately. She gestured toward the back door that led to her private quarters, and Matthew nodded, making his way through the crowd. He found her in her small office behind the main saloon, where she kept the books and handled the business side of the establishment. It was a neat, practical space that reflected its owner's personality. Is the boy settled? She asked as he entered. Sound asleep at Mrs. Hoffman's, Matthew confirmed. I'm taking him out to the ranch tomorrow, Daisy nodded. It's a good thing you're doing, Matt. It's the right thing, he said simply. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her. How are you, Daisy, really? She sighed, setting aside the ledger she'd been reviewing. I'm managing. The business is doing well enough. Better than expected, honestly. I'm not surprised. You always were the smartest of us all. A small smile played at her lips. Flattery, Matt, that's not like you. Just stating facts, he replied with a shrug. You've built something good here. We all do what we must, she said, a hint of old pain flashing in her eyes. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words and shared history. Matthew took off his hat, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of nervous energy he'd had since childhood. I've been thinking about the past a lot lately, he said quietly. Daisy's expression became guarded. That's dangerous territory, Matt, maybe, but seeing that boy today, it brought things back, reminded me of when we were young. We're not young anymore, she said softly. We've both made our choices. Matthew took a step forward. Some choices can be unmade, Daisy. She looked away, her hands fidgeting with the pen on her desk. "It's been 5 years, Matt. Things change, people change." "Some things don't," he insisted. "Some feelings don't." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the office door and Joe the barkeeper poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Miss Daisy, but there's a situation with some drovers getting rowdy at the bar." Daisy straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. "I'll be right there." As Joe withdrew, she gave Matthew an apologetic look. "Duty calls." "It always does," he said with a touch of resignation. "I'll see you in the morning before we head out." She nodded, and for a brief moment he thought she might say something more. Instead, she simply touched his arm as she passed, the brief contact sending a familiar warmth through him. Matthew watched her go, then placed his hat back on his head and stepped out into the night. The stars were bright overhead, and as he walked back to the boarding house, he found himself pondering the strange turns life took, how a simple act of kindness toward a hungry boy had unexpectedly reopened a door he'd thought closed forever. Morning came bright and clear, with the promise of summer heat later in the day. Tommy woke to the unfamiliar sensation of a comfortable bed and the smell of cooking food from downstairs. For a moment, he was disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. He dressed quickly in his old clothes, now clean thanks to Mrs. Hoffman's insistence on washing them overnight. They still looked worn and patched, but at least they didn't carry the dirt and grime of weeks on the street. Downstairs, he found Matthew already at the table, deep in conversation with Mrs. Hoffman. They both looked up as he entered. "Ah, there he is," Mrs. Hoffman said warmly. "Sit, sit. Boys need breakfast to grow strong." Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He slid into a chair as Mrs. Hoffman placed a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and fresh bread in front of him. "We'll need to get you some proper clothes before we head to the ranch," Matthew said as Tommy ate. "Can't have you working in those rags." After breakfast, they visited the general store where Matthew purchased sturdy work clothes, a pair of boots, and even a small hat to protect Tommy from the harsh sun. The boy stood awkwardly as the shopkeeper measured him, unused to such attention and uncomfortable with someone spending money on him. "I'll pay you back," he promised Matthew as they left the store, Tommy now dressed in his new clothes. Matthew smiled. "You'll work it off at the ranch." That's payment enough. Their last stop before leaving town was the Silver Dollar. Tommy waited outside with their horses, a sturdy gelding for Matthew, and a gentle mare that Tommy would ride while Matthew went inside to speak with Daisy. Inside, Matthew found Daisy supervising the morning cleaning. The saloon wouldn't open until noon, and the large room felt different in the daylight, less mysterious, more ordinary. "You're heading out?" she asked when she saw him. "Yes, wanted to say goodbye first." He hesitated, then added, "and to ask if you'd consider something." Daisy raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Come out to the ranch this Sunday, for dinner," he said. "The boy could use some female influence and—" He trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain, and she prompted, "And I'd like to see you away from here, just to talk." Daisy studied his face for a long moment. "Just to talk," she repeated, as if testing the words. "That's all," he assured her. "For now," a small smile tugged at her lips. "For now," she echoed. "All right, Matt, Sunday dinner it is." His face brightened. "I'll send someone to fetch you around noon." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Matt, take good care of that boy." "I will," he promised, knowing she understood better than most what it meant to be young and alone in the world. Outside, Tommy was waiting patiently, nervously stroking his mare's nose. "Everything okay, Mr. Wade?" "Matt," the cowboy corrected automatically. "And yes, everything's fine. Miss King will be joining us for dinner on Sunday." Tommy's face lit with a knowing smile. "That's nice." Matthew ruffled the boy's hair. "Let's get moving. It's a few hours' ride to the ranch, and I want to get you settled before the day's out." The ride to the Bar W Ranch took them through rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood trees along the creeks. Tommy had never been this far from town before, and he gazed around with wide-eyed wonder at the vastness of the landscape. "Is it always this big?" he asked, gesturing at the open country around them. Matthew chuckled. "It is. Takes some getting used to, but after a while, town starts to feel too crowded." As they rode, Matthew pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his time at the ranch. Tommy listened eagerly, asking questions and soaking up information like a sponge. "How long have you known Miss King?" Tommy asked during a lull in the conversation. Matthew gave him a sidelong glance. "Curious, aren't you?" Tommy shrugged. "Just wondering." With a sigh, Matthew gave in. "We grew up together. Her father ran the mercantile in town, and my foster father did business with him regularly. Daisy and I were friends from the time we were about your age." "Just friends?" Tommy pressed. Matthew's lips twitched. "No, not just friends, not later anyway. We were sweet on each other from about 16 on. Planned to get married when I turned 21 and had saved enough to buy a small spread of my own." "What happened?" Matthew's expression grew distant. "War happened. The conflict between the states was over, but there were still skirmishes with raiders along the border. I joined up with a militia group to help protect the territory." He paused. "I was gone for almost 3 years, and when you came back," Tommy prompted, "when I came back, everything had changed. Daisy's father had died, leaving her with debts. She sold the mercantile to pay them off and used what little was left to buy the saloon. It was run down then, barely making money." "She didn't want to marry you anymore?" Tommy asked, confused. Matthew's jaw tightened. "She said she couldn't leave the business she'd just started." "I said I couldn't stay in town when I'd been promised a position at the Bar W. We were both stubborn." He sighed. "Looking back, I think we were both scared of failing, of making the wrong choice, so we made no choice at all and let things drift apart." Tommy considered this with the straightforward logic of youth. "That seems silly." A surprised laugh escaped Matthew. "You know, Tommy, you're absolutely right. It was silly. 5 years of silly." They fell silent as they crested a hill and the Bar W spread out below them. It was impressive, a large main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings, all surrounded by corrals and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. In the distance, cowboys could be seen moving among the herds. "Wow," Tommy breathed. "Home," Matthew said simply. "Come on, let's introduce you to everyone." The next few days passed in a blur for Tommy. The ranch was a world of new experiences: the early mornings, the constant activity, the camaraderie of the cowboys who lived in the bunkhouse. Matthew had arranged for Tommy to have a small room off the kitchen in the main house, where the cook, an old Chinese man named Lin, kept a watchful eye on him. Tommy threw himself into his new responsibilities with enthusiasm. He mucked stalls, fetched water, helped Lin in the kitchen, and watched the cowboys with wide-eyed admiration. By the end of the first week, his city pallor had already begun to darken to a cowboy's tan, and the regular meals had put a hint of fullness in his formerly gaunt cheeks. Matthew watched the boys' progress with quiet satisfaction. The ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named William Wilson, had raised an eyebrow at first but quickly warmed to Tommy's earnest efforts. "Boy's a worker," Wilson commented to Matthew on Saturday evening as they watched Tommy helping to brush down the horses. "Good instincts with the animals, too." "He's coming along," Matthew agreed, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Wilson gave his foreman a shrewd look. "Heard you invited the King woman for dinner tomorrow." Matthew stiffened slightly. "Is that a problem, sir?" Wilson waved a dismissive hand. "Your business, Wade, just don't let it interfere with running my ranch." "It won't," Matthew promised. "Good. Because if you finally get your head on straight and marry that woman, I expect you'll still keep your position here." Matthew stared at his boss in surprise. Wilson rarely involved himself in his employees' personal lives. The older man shrugged at Matthew's expression. "Been watching you pine for 5 years. Gets tiresome. Sort it out." With that parting advice, Wilson headed back to the main house, leaving Matthew speechless in the yard. Sunday dawned clear and promising. Tommy was up early, helping Lynn prepare for the special dinner. The cook had planned an impressive meal of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie, a feast by ranch standards. Matthew seemed unusually nervous, changing his shirt twice and pacing the porch as the time for Daisy's arrival approached. Tommy watched this with amusement, exchanging knowing looks with Lynn. "Mr. Wade's sweet on lady," Lynn observed quietly as he rolled out pie dough. "Yep," Tommy agreed, peeling apples with careful concentration. "And she's sweet on him too, I think." Lynn nodded sagely. Long time coming. 5 years, I hear, Tommy shook his head. Grown-ups can be real silly sometimes. This earned him a rare smile from the usually stoic cook. Very true, young Tommy, very true. At noon precisely, the sound of approaching horses drew them all outside. One of the younger cowboys, sent to fetch Daisy, was escorting her wagon up the drive. She sat on the bench seat, wearing a pretty blue dress that Tommy had never seen at the saloon. Her hair was arranged more carefully than usual, with a few curls framing her face. Matthew stepped forward to help her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Tommy noticed how they both seemed to stand straighter in each other's presence, how their eyes kept finding each other even as they exchanged pleasantries. "You must be ready for some refreshment after the drive," Matthew was saying. "Tommy, would you show Miss King where she can freshen up?" Tommy nodded eagerly, pleased to be included. As he led Daisy to the washroom off the kitchen, she smiled down at him. "You look different, Tommy," she observed. "Healthier, happier." "I like it here," he admitted. "Mr. Wade, Matt, he's teaching me about horses and cattle, and Lynn's teaching me to cook. And Mr. Wilson says if I keep working hard, I might get to help with the roundup next spring." "Sounds like you've found your place," she said warmly. "Maybe," he agreed. Then, emboldened by her friendly manner, he added, "Matt talks about you a lot." A hint of color touched her cheeks. "Does he now?" Tommy nodded. "He told me about how you were going to get married before he went away." "He seemed sad about that." Daisy's expression softened. "It was complicated, Tommy." "That's what grown-ups always say when they make things harder than they need to be," he observed. A surprised laugh escaped her. "My goodness, you're a direct one, aren't you?" he shrugged. "Just saying what I see." Daisy studied him thoughtfully. "And what do you see, Tommy? Two people who look at each other like my ma and pa used to," he said simply. "Like nothing else matters much when they're together." Emotion flickered across Daisy's face: surprise, vulnerability, and something warmer. She reached out to squeeze his shoulder. "You're quite perceptive for your age." "I've been watching people a long time," he explained. "When you don't have anyone, you learn to see things." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with conversation flowing easily among them. Wilson joined them, his gruff manner softening somewhat in Daisy's presence. He told stories of the early days of the ranch, and Daisy shared news from town. Tommy contributed enthusiastic accounts of his new experiences, making them all laugh with his descriptions of his first attempts at various ranch tasks. After the meal, Wilson excused himself to attend to ranch business, and Lynn shooed Tommy into the kitchen to help with dishes, leaving Matthew and Daisy alone on the front porch. Through the window, Tommy could see them sitting in rocking chairs, talking quietly as the afternoon sun bathed them in golden light. "Not polite to spy," Lynn admonished, though his tone was mild. "I'm not spying," Tommy protested. "I'm observing," Lynn snorted. "Same thing, give them privacy." Reluctantly, Tommy turned his attention back to the dishes, but his mind remained on the couple outside. There was something right about them together, something that made sense in a way he couldn't quite explain but deeply felt. Later, as the sun began to set, Matthew offered to show Daisy around the ranch before she needed to head back to town. Tommy watched from the kitchen doorway as they walked together toward the corral, Matthew's hand lightly touching the small of Daisy's back. "Think they'll figure it out?" He asked Lynn, who was preparing dough for the next day's bread. "Maybe," the cook replied. "Sometimes takes long time to find way back to right path." On the other side of the ranch, Matthew and Daisy stood by the corral fence, watching the horses graze in the evening light. A comfortable silence had fallen between them, the kind that only comes with long acquaintance. "Tommy's thriving here," Daisy observed. "You've done a good thing for him, Matt. He's a good kid, smart, eager to learn." Matthew smiled. "Reminds me a bit of myself at that age." "I can see that," she agreed. "Though I hope he's less stubborn." Matthew chuckled. "God help us all if he's as stubborn as I was, as we both were," he amended, glancing at her. Daisy's expression grew thoughtful. "We were young, Matt, young and scared and proud, and now," he asked quietly. "Now we're older, hopefully wiser." She turned to face him fully. "I've missed you, you know. Even with you coming into town regularly, it wasn't the same." "What wasn't the same?" "Us, this." she gestured between them, just talking, being together without all the weight of what went wrong. Matthew took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about what went wrong, about why I couldn't stay in town, why you couldn't leave. We were both so sure our paths had to go in different directions. They did, at the time, she said softly. I had to prove I could make it on my own after Father died. You had to make your own way too, away from the shadows of the war. And now, he asked, echoing her earlier question, where do our paths go now, Daisy? She looked out over the ranch, the land turning purple and gold in the fading light. I don't know, Matt. The saloon is successful now. I could sell it if I wanted to, start something new. Hope flickered in his eyes. And would you want to? It would depend, she said carefully, on what I'd be starting instead. Matthew took her hand then, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. 5 years is a long time to waste on pride and fear, Daisy. I don't want to waste any more. What are you saying, Matt? I'm saying I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, and I'm saying that I think there's a place for you here if you want it, with me. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Just like that, after all this time, not just like that, he corrected. After 5 years of regret. After finally realizing what Tommy figured out in about 5 minutes that we're better together than apart, a smile broke through her tears. That boy is too smart for his own good. Is that a yes? Matthew asked, hope plain in his voice. Instead of answering directly, Daisy stepped closer and raised a hand to his cheek. I never stopped loving you either, Matt, not for a single day. He pulled her close then, and when their lips met, it was both familiar and new, a homecoming and a beginning all at once. From the kitchen window, Tommy quickly ducked out of sight, a grin spreading across his face. Lynn shot him a look of mock disapproval. Definitely spying now, the cook said dryly. Definitely worth it, Tommy replied, unrepentant. They're kissing. Lynn's stern expression softened into a rare smile. About time. The autumn wedding of Matthew Wade and Daisy King was the social event of the season in Silverridge. The entire town turned out to see the union of the respected ranch foreman and the popular saloon owner, two of their own who had finally found their way back to each other. Tommy, dressed in his Sunday best and bursting with pride, stood as Matthew's best man. As he watched the couple exchange vows, he couldn't help but feel that his life had changed irrevocably that day, when desperation had driven him to steal a loaf of bread, when a simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would heal old wounds and create a new family. After the ceremony, as guests gathered for the celebration, Daisy sought out Tommy. She knelt to straighten his tie, her eyes warm with affection. You know, she said softly, when Matt told me he was bringing you to the ranch, I had a feeling everything was about to change. For the better. Tommy asked. She smiled, glancing over at Matthew, who was accepting congratulations from the ranch hands. Definitely for the better. Does this mean I'll be living with both of you now? Tommy asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice despite his happiness for them. Daisy's expression grew serious. Tommy, Matt and I have been talking about that. We'd like to formally adopt you if you're agreeable, make you legally our son. Tommy stared at her, momentarily speechless. Really, you want me? More than anything, she assured him. We already consider you family, but we want to make it official. Emotion welled up in Tommy's throat, making it hard to speak. He nodded vigorously, then threw his arms around Daisy's neck in an impulsive hug. Matthew joined them, placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Everything all right here? Everything's perfect, Daisy said, her eyes shining with happy tears. Later, as the celebration continued under the stars, Tommy sat with Lynn, watching Matthew and Daisy dance together in the light of paper lanterns strung across the town square. You did good thing, Lynn told him, nodding toward the couple. Bringing them together, Tommy shook his head. I didn't do anything, they just needed a little push to remember what was important. Sometimes little push is everything, Lynn said wisely. Like bread that brings hungry boy to right place at right time. Tommy smiled at the thought. From desperation to belonging, from hunger to family, all because a cowboy had taken his hand instead of calling the sheriff. Life, he was learning, could change in an instant, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes gloriously, unexpectedly for the better. As the evening drew to a close, Matthew and Daisy found Tommy half asleep on a bench. Matthew scooped him up as if he weighed nothing, and together the new family headed toward their wagon for the ride home, not to the saloon or the bunkhouse, but to the small house on the edge of the ranch property that would now be their shared home. "Ready to go home, son?" Matthew asked softly. Tommy nodded against his shoulder, too tired to speak, but filled with a contentment he had thought lost forever after his parents' deaths. As he drifted toward sleep, cradled in Matthew's strong arms with Daisy's gentle hand smoothing his hair, Tommy knew he had found where he belonged, not just a place to eat and sleep, but a true home with people who loved him. And it had all begun with a stolen loaf of bread and a cowboy who had seen not a thief, but a hungry child in need of kindness.